Imagine, just for a moment, a world where humans weren't the only, well, us, where other human species, walked the earth right alongside Homo sapiens. It's a really thought-provoking image, isn't it? Hello, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on this incredible journey through time. We're going to explore the very essence of what it means to be human, and maybe more critically, how we actually got to where we are right now.
Yeah, and our mission on this deep dive is to unpack some selected insights from Yuval Noah Harari's, really groundbreaking book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. And this isn't just a history book, listing dates and events. It's a profound, sweeping story. It really challenges a lot of our kind of ingrained assumptions about ourselves, our past, our place in the world. It offers this unique perspective on our present and maybe our potential future.
Absolutely. You've entrusted us with these fascinating excerpts, and our goal here is really to distill the most important nuggets, to sort of connect the dots between Harari's big ideas, these revolutionary concepts, and will help you grasp those profound aha moments that make this book so impactful. Essentially, we're going to dive deep into his remarkable summary of the human story, exploring how we, Homo sapiens, went from being this, pretty insignificant animal in a forgotten corner of Africa to the undisputed master of the planet. And what that journey truly cost, and maybe where it's leading us, it's a story that's, brimming with both incredible ingenuity and some profoundly unforeseen consequences. So let's begin to unpack this. When we typically think of humans, we often unconsciously assume we've always been the sole species. It's almost like human just automatically means Homo sapiens, doesn't it?
It does.
But Sapiens immediately challenges this really deeply ingrained perception. It reveals that for millions of years, from roughly 2 million years ago until, get this, as recently as 10,000 years ago, the world was home to multiple distinct human species simultaneously.
Yeah, simultaneously. This wasn't some brief anomaly. It was pretty much the biological norm for a vast stretch of our evolutionary history.
And that's precisely what's so fascinating here. Our current exclusivity, being the only human species on Earth, is actually the peculiar situation, historically speaking. I mean, think about it. Today, we have lots of species of foxes, bears, pigs, right, roaming the planet.
Sure.
Yet, 100 millennia ago, at least 6 different species of man walked the Earth, coexisting or, perhaps competing. This singular state we find ourselves in now is highly unusual. The book provocatively suggests that we, sapiens, might even have good reasons to repress the memory of our siblings, given their rather convenient disappearance as we rose to dominance.
Oof.
It certainly implies an uncomfortable truth, doesn't it, about what our ancestors might have done to ensure our unique and solitary path to planetary mastery. That is a truly unsettling thought, but it completely reframes how we see ourselves, who we are. So, what actually ignited our ascent from, obscurity? Harari points to something else that defines us: our exceptionally large brains. It seems like a no-brainer, excuse the pun, that bigger is better when it comes to intelligence.
Right, seems obvious.
But consider this. Mammals weighing, say, 60 kilograms typically have an average brain size around 200 cubic centimeters.
Okay.
Early men and women, maybe 2.5 million years ago, had brains about 3 times that size, around 600 cubic centimeters.
A big jump already.
But modern sapiens, that's us, we average a whopping 1,200 to 1,400 cubic centimeters.
Wow.
And to really put it in perspective, the Neanderthals, our close relatives, actually had brains that were, on average, even bigger than ours.
Which immediately leads us to ask, right? If bigger brains are such an incredible advantage, why don't all animals possess them?
Exactly. There has to be a trade-off.
Yeah, there is. A huge one. The book points out the immense biological cost associated with such a large brain. Firstly, it's just an energy hog. It consumes an inordinate amount of calories, maybe 25% of our body's total energy when we're just resting.
25%, just for the brain.
Yeah, far more than the average mammals, maybe 8%. Secondly, this energy drain seems to come at the expense of muscle mass. Our ancestors, even with bigger brains, weren't necessarily physically stronger than many other animals.
Okay.
And thirdly, and this is perhaps the most crucial part, a large brain requires premature births. Human babies are born incredibly helpless, with many vital systems still underdeveloped. Their brains are relatively small at birth and only fully develop outside the womb.
Right, they need so much care for so long.
For years, they're dependent on elders for sustenance, protection, education. Contrast that with a colt, which can trot shortly after birth, or a kitten leaving his mother to forage in just weeks. This profound biological vulnerability, it really necessitated greater collective care and long-term education. It kind of laid some of the earliest groundwork for our complex social structures, our extended families.
It's humbling to think about, even with those crucial advantages like fire, which allowed us to cook food, get more nutrients, reduce digestion energy, and these increasingly large brains. About 150,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was still pretty marginal, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We were primarily confined to a corner of East Africa, really just a blip on the ecological radar.
Mhm.
All human species combined at that time, stretching across these vast distances from Indonesia maybe to Iberia, numbered perhaps no more than 1 million individuals. Total.
A million total humans of all species. Wow.
Yeah. We were definitely not the masters of the planet then, nor did we look like we were destined for it.
Right, and the story of how we became the only ones is also complicated.
Very. The book highlights how, for decades, the common scientific wisdom, the replacement theory, held that sapiens just replaced other human species, simply outcompeted them, maybe, without any significant interbreeding.
It's sort of a clean sweep.
Kind of. And this theory was, in some ways, also maybe politically correct, as it avoided tricky discussions about genetic diversity among modern humans.
Okay.
But that narrative was dramatically upended in 2010. The publication of the Neanderthal genome just stunned the scientific community. It revealed significant genetic overlap with contemporary humans from Europe and Asia, like 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in many people today.
No kidding. So we did interbreed.
It strongly suggests so.
Yeah.
This monumental discovery shattered that pure sapiens narrative. It points to a far more complex and, perhaps as the book puts it, incriminating truth about our ancestors and their intimate interactions with other human species.
Incriminating. That's a strong word.
It is. It makes you wonder.
Yeah.
If Neanderthals had survived, would we still view ourselves as uniquely separate from the animal kingdom? Or would Darwin's ideas maybe have been accepted much more readily, without needing this idea of a pure sapiens lineage?
Fascinating counterfactual. So if it wasn't just big brains, what was the real game changer? Harari argues it was something he calls the cognitive revolution, occurring roughly, 70,000 years ago?
Around then, yeah.
And this is where our language became, as he puts it, amazingly supple.
That's the key. It wasn't just about making sounds to warn of danger, like lion or snake. It was about the revolutionary ability to connect a limited number of sounds and signs, to produce an infinite number of sentences, each carrying a distinct and incredibly nuanced meaning. We could talk about things that weren't right there in front of us.
Like planning or storytelling.
Exactly. Unlike a green monkey yelling, "Careful, a lion."
Which is a simple, direct warning about the present. Humans developed the capacity to communicate unbelievably complex fictions, hypotheticals, stories. We could say, this morning near the bend in the river, I saw a lion tracking a herd of bison. We should talk about how to hunt it.
Right, sharing detailed information about the past, planning for the future. Precisely. This level of detail, this ability to share rich hypothetical scenarios, allows for storing and communicating just prodigious amounts of information. And that enabled unprecedented levels of cooperation among very large groups. Other animals cooperate, sure, but not on this scale, not with this kind of complexity.
And this complex, adaptable language leads to a truly fascinating and, foundational idea in the book. The appearance of fiction, or as Harari calls them, imagined realities.
Mm-hmm.
The book argues that successful cooperation among humans, especially beyond a group size of about 150 individuals.
The Dunbar's number, roughly.
Right, which is considered the natural limit for groups like chimpanzees, where everyone knows everyone else personally. Successful cooperation beyond that size is enabled by believing in common myths.
Yes. Beyond that number, you just can't rely on intimate knowledge and gossip alone to maintain order. You need something bigger, something shared and abstract to bind people together.
Like shared stories, shared gods, shared values.
Exactly. Think about family businesses, right? Mm-hmm. They often face these existential crises when they grow past that size, if they can't reinvent their internal culture and find some shared purpose beyond just personal relationships.
That makes sense.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you'll see that so many crucial human constructs that govern our lives, things like gods, nations, money, human rights, corporations, they exist only within our common imagination.
They're not physical objects.
Nope. The book uses the brilliant example of Peugeot SA, the car company. Peugeot itself has no physical existence. Its factories, workers, shareholders, they're all physical, tangible things. But Peugeot SA itself, it's a legal fiction, yet it's a legal entity that can open bank accounts, own property, pay taxes, be sued, completely separate from any individual human involved.
Right, yeah.
And this concept, the limited liability company, Harari calls it humanity's most ingenious invention
Why?
because it allows for vast, large-scale cooperation among strangers without personal liability. Think about Jean, the wagon maker in 13th century France. If his business failed, he could lose everything, his house, his cow, even see his children sold into servitude to cover debts.
Oh, wow.
But a modern shareholder, they risk only their investment. This invention just paved the way for unprecedented economic and social scale. It fundamentally reshaped how humans organize themselves.
So just to clarify, it's really important to get this distinction. An imagined reality is not the same as a lie.
Crucial distinction, yes.
A lie implies, it's untrue saying there's a lion over there when you know perfectly well there isn't one, maybe to distract someone.
Right? Even a monkey can do that to get a banana.
Exactly. But an imagined reality is a shared belief. It's a collective agreement in a fiction that allows us to function together. It's this universal acceptance of a concept like human rights or the United States or the euro that enables millions, even billions of strangers to cooperate towards common goals, even though those concepts have no objective physical presence.
Precisely. Ever since the cognitive revolution, Sapiens has effectively lived in this kind of dual reality. On one hand, there's the objective reality, physical rivers, trees, lions, concrete things. On the other hand, there's this imagined reality of abstract gods, powerful nations, sprawling corporations.
And the imagined reality became more powerful.
In many ways, yes. The critical point Harari makes is that as time went on, this imagined reality became so incredibly powerful, so deeply ingrained, that the very survival and future of our objective world, the rivers, the trees, the climate, now depends heavily on these imagined entities like nations and corporations and international agreements.
That's a heavy thought.
It is, and our unique ability to change these collective myths relatively rapidly. Think of the French Revolution, almost overnight shifting from the divine right of kings to the sovereignty of the people.
Yeah, a total rewrite of the imagined order.
Exactly. This allowed for what Harari calls a fast lane of cultural evolution.
Yeah.
It basically bypassed the incredibly slow, often gridlocked process of genetic evolution, which largely dictates social behavior in other animals. A female chimpanzee can't just decide to stage a feminist revolution based on how bonobos behave. That would require huge genetic changes over millennia.
Right.
But Homo sapiens, because of fiction, could rapidly reorganize society, allowing us to quickly outstrip all other species in cooperation, adaptation, and ultimately dominance.
So with these revolutionary cognitive abilities, this power of fiction, what was life actually like for these sapiens? After the cognitive revolution, but before agriculture really took hold, say, between 70,000 and 12,000 years ago, the book calls them foragers, right?
That's right, foragers.
Yeah.
And their lives, perhaps surprisingly, challenge a lot of our common assumptions about what a primitive existence really meant. Well, unfortunately, getting certainty about forager life is really scarce. It's a tough area for historians. We don't have any written records from that far back, obviously. And the archaeological evidence we do have is heavily biased towards durable stuff, stone tools, bones.
Things that last.
Exactly. Which means our understanding of their rich mental lives, their religious beliefs, their emotional worlds, it's largely lost to us. Harari uses the analogy of trying to understand 21st century teenagers just from their discarded phones and gadgets. You'd get a very incomplete, maybe even misleading picture.
Yeah, definitely.
Plus, foragers generally moved around a lot carrying only essential stuff. This implies a life less focused on accumulating physical things and more focused on immediate needs and knowledge of their environment.
That makes sense. And here's a truly surprising detail Harari highlights. The average sapien's brain size has actually decreased since the age of foraging.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? It makes you pause.
It really does. What kind of intense mental demands were placed on them for survival back then?
Well, it suggests that superb mental abilities, encyclopedic knowledge of their surroundings, plants, animals, terrain, weather, were required from everyone just to survive day to day. You had to be sharp.
A generalist, almost.
Very much so. Agriculture and industry, paradoxically, seem to have opened up these niches for imbeciles, as Harari puts it rather bluntly, places where you could survive and pass on your genes with much simpler, more specialized tasks, carrying water, pulling a plow, working on an assembly line without needing that constant holistic environmental awareness.
So a trade-off maybe between individual cognitive breadth and collective societal complexity.
That seems to be the implication, yeah.
And what about their diet?
Oh, their diet is remarkably fascinating. It was incredibly varied, much more so than later agricultural societies. This variety protected them from starvation and malnutrition, which became major killers for farmers relying on single crops.
Right. If your wheat crop failed, you were in big trouble.
Exactly. But foragers ate dozens of different things. Daily berries, mushrooms, snails, turtles, maybe some rabbit steak. A completely different menu from one day to the next.
Sounds pretty good, actually.
Doesn't it? This dietary variety ensured they got all the necessary nutrients, probably far exceeding many modern diets, ironically.
Yeah.
And combine that with constant physical activity, tracking prey, gathering food, traversing diverse landscapes, they were likely as fit as marathon runners. Incredible dexterity, spatial awareness. Things people today often struggle to achieve, even with dedicated practice.
So it's no wonder that many experts, looking at this varied diet, the relatively short working week compared to later farmers, the rarity of infectious diseases spreading in small, mobile groups, they've provocatively called these pre-agricultural forager societies the original affluent societies.
Yeah, it paints this picture of relative ease and abundance. Certainly not the brutal, desperate struggle we often imagine.
There's always a but.
Always. The book quickly cautions against idealizing it. It definitely wasn't some kind of utopia.
Right, so how harsh was it in reality?
Well, while maybe generally better in some ways than the grinding toil of early agricultural life,
Yeah.
their world was undeniably unforgiving. Periods of scarcity and hardship definitely happened. Child mortality was tragically high. What we'd consider a minor accident today, a broken bone, a bad infection, could easily be fatal.
No antibiotics, no modern surgery.
Exactly. And beyond the physical dangers, think about the psychological burden. Incurring hostility from your small, interdependent band. That could be absolutely terrible. Ostracization was essentially a death sentence.
You couldn't survive alone.
Pretty much impossible.
Yeah.
The book mentions the Ache tribe, a modern forager group studied by anthropologists, as offering a stark, maybe chilling illustration. Old people who couldn't keep up. Disabled individuals, even unwanted infants. They were occasionally abandoned or even killed.
Killed.
Yeah, sometimes for reasons that seem incredibly arbitrary to us, like a man being in a bad mood or a child being funny-looking or being born without hair. One woman recalled her first baby girl was killed simply because the men in the band didn't want another girl. It reminds us of the harsh, pragmatic realities of survival that could sometimes override sentiment.
And what about their spiritual lives? You mentioned animism earlier.
Right. The book suggests ancient foragers were probably animists. They likely saw non-human entities, animals, plants, rivers, rocks, not just as resources, but as beings with their own agency, their own spirits. There wasn't necessarily this strict human hierarchy over nature that we see later. The world, for them, certainly didn't revolve around humans alone.
So more integrated with nature in a way?
You could say that. But it's crucial to understand that animism isn't one single religion. It's more like a generic name for thousands of very different religions, cults, and beliefs that existed across the globe. What makes them animist is this common approach, the belief that the world is populated by many conscious beings, and humans aren't necessarily central or superior. This contrasts really sharply with later theistic views, hierarchical gods who created the world specifically for humanity. Trying to describe specific archaic spirituality, though, it's highly speculative. The limited evidence we have, a few artifacts, some cave paintings, can be interpreted in countless ways.
Right, projecting our own ideas onto the past.
Exactly. The book suggests, maybe a bit cynically, that the theories of modern scholars often tell us more about the prejudices and assumptions of the scholars themselves than they do about actual Stone Age religions. It highlights the huge challenge of interpreting such ancient, elusive belief systems.
Okay, so even before agriculture fundamentally reshaped the planet, Homo sapiens was already leaving a significant mark, a destructive one even.
Yes, often devastatingly so. Harari points to the extinction of the Australian megafauna as perhaps the first significant mark of our species' impact, long before we built cities or had advanced technology.
The megafauna, like giant kangaroos. Yeah.
Exactly. Huge animals. Marsupial lions, enormous diprotodons weighing several tons, giant kangaroos, creatures that had lived and evolved in Australia for millions of years. They vanished around the time sapiens first arrived on the continent, roughly 45,000 years ago. Within a few thousand years of our arrival, most of these large species were gone.
Coincidence.
Hard to prove definitively, but the pattern is highly suggestive, and it repeats elsewhere. When sapiens reached the Americas about 16,000 years ago, crossing the land bridge from Siberia, their arrival was swiftly followed by an even larger ecological disaster. Woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats wiped out across North and South America.
Wow.
And the pattern continues on islands. Almost every island across the Pacific and Indian Ocean saw its unique fauna, often including flightless birds and giant reptiles, vanish soon after the first human farmers arrived, except for extremely remote places like the Galapagos, which remained uninhabited until the 19th century. Our arrival consistently correlates with mass extinctions.
So this early history suggests our impact, even as foragers with relatively simple tools, was far from benign.
Far from it. It sets a rather unsettling precedent for the monumental changes that came later. It indicates our species has always been a powerful, often destructive force on ecosystems.
It really challenges that romantic notion of early humans living in perfect harmony with nature, the noble savage idea.
It certainly complicates it, yeah. Our ecological footprint seems to have been significant from very early on.
Right. Now, let's fast forward to what the book provocatively calls history's biggest fraud.
Ah, yes, the agricultural revolution.
Exactly. For a staggering 2.5 million years, humans lived by hunting and gathering, a lifestyle that, as we've discussed, supported a varied diet, relatively good health, maybe more leisure time. So why on earth would we change such a successful, long-standing way of life? It seems crazy.
It does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? Harari's argument is pretty radical here. He says it wasn't really humanity domesticating plants. It was more like wheat domesticated us.
Wheat domesticated us? How does that work?
Well, think about it from wheat's perspective. 10,000 years ago, it was just one wild grass among many, confined to a small region in the Middle East. Suddenly, within a couple of millennia, it's growing all over the world.
Okay.
Humans cleared forests, moved rocks, carried water, fought off pests, all for wheat. We fundamentally changed our lifestyle, settling down, working much harder to cultivate these specific plants. By 3500 BC, over 90% of humanity's calories came from just a handful of plants domesticated between 9500 and 3500 BC staple crops, like wheat, rice, maize, corn, potatoes, millet, barley.
90% from just a few plants.
Yeah, and this wasn't just a Middle Eastern thing. It happened independently all over the world. Central America domesticating maize and beans, China domesticating rice and millet, New Guineans taming sugarcane and bananas. This global independent shift just highlights its profound and irreversible impact on human civilization. Wheat, rice, potatoes, they conquered us, in a way.
Okay, I see the argument. But it still seems completely counterintuitive from the human perspective. Why give up a relatively good life, a varied diet, more free time, for seemingly more miserable existence tied to the land?
Exactly.
Wheat didn't offer a better diet, did it? I mean, a cereal-based diet is notoriously poor in minerals and vitamins. It's hard to digest, bad for your teeth.
All true. And it didn't offer economic security either. Farmers relied on far fewer species. If your single crop failed due to drought or pests, you faced catastrophic famine.
Whereas foragers had diverse options.
Right. Their diverse diet provided resilience against scarcity. So it leads to that crucial question.
Right.
Why did people make such a fateful miscalculation?
Yeah, why?
Harari calls it a luxury trap.
A luxury trap.
Yeah. The agricultural revolution wasn't a sudden conscious choice. It was a gradual affair, unfolding over centuries, millennia even. Each small change seemed beneficial in the short term. People thought, okay, yes, we'll have to work a bit harder, maybe tend this batch of wild wheat more carefully, but the harvest will be so bountiful, our children will never go hungry.
The promise of more food.
The promise of security. This logical, short-term calculation, repeated generation after generation, led to vastly increased populations, absolutely. But often it resulted in a far harsher, more monotonous, disease-ridden existence for the average individual.
More people, but maybe less happy people.
Arguably, yes. More susceptible to famine, disease spread easily in settled communities, more grueling labor. It's a key insight into how humans often miscalculate long-term consequences. We get caught in these traps where small, seemingly rational improvements gradually chain us to a less desirable overall existence, all in pursuit of a perceived better life.
That's sobering. Is there evidence against purely economic motives?
There is some fascinating archaeological evidence that challenges the idea that agriculture was just about getting more food efficiently. Göbekli Tepe in southeast Turkey.
Göbekli Tepe. Tell me about that.
Excavations there have uncovered these stunning, monumental pillared structures. Huge karst stones, weighing up to 7 tons each, arranged in circles, and they date back to around 12,000 years ago.
12,000. That's before widespread agriculture, right?
Exactly. Older than Stonehenge.
Yeah.
And crucially, there are no signs of permanent settlements nearby. No houses, no trash pits suggesting daily life.
So what were they doing there?
It strongly suggests that large groups of foragers came together for communal purposes, perhaps religious ceremonies or social gatherings, to build these massive structures before they settled down to farm. This implies that maybe the need for more food production to support these larger gatherings in monumental building projects could have actually motivated the adoption of agriculture.
Ah, so culture or religion driving agriculture, not the other way around.
It flips the traditional narrative, doesn't it? Instead of agriculture leading to settlements and complex societies, maybe the drive for complex social or ritual activities spurred the need for agriculture. It's a really intriguing possibility.
Wow. And what about animals? Domestication wasn't just plants.
No, absolutely not. Parallel to plant domestication, humans also domesticated animals. A similar gradual process, selecting for useful traits like submissiveness, high milk yield, thick wool. We brought sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, cattle, donkeys into our orbit. Initially, hunters might have just adopted a lamb, maybe fattening it up for later. Over time, they selected the most docile, the least aggressive for reproduction, leading eventually to herds of domesticated, compliant animals quite different from their wild ancestors.
And they provided more than just meat.
Oh, much more. Meat, milk, eggs, yes, but also crucial raw materials like skins and wool, and profoundly, muscle power.
Ah, beasts of burden.
Exactly. Tasks that previously required human muscle transport, plowing fields, grinding grain, were increasingly carried out by animals. This was a huge energy revolution in itself. It led to the emergence of new pastoralist societies, focused primarily on exploiting animal herds, adding yet another layer to our expanding control over the natural world and enabling life in environments unsuitable for farming.
Okay, so the agricultural revolution, with its promise of more food, even if a trap, inevitably led to massive population growth.
Huge growth, yeah.
And the development of larger, more permanent settlements. Villages grew into towns. You mentioned Saralhuyuk.
Right, in modern Turkey. By 7,000 BC, it might have had 5,000 to 10,000 people, a huge concentration for the time.
Then came cities and eventually empires. By 2250 BC, Sargon the Great's Akkadian Empire apparently had over 1 million subjects.
An astonishing number.
This immense scale, far beyond that 150-person limit where everyone knows each other, it must have demanded entirely new forms of social organization and new ways to get people to buy into it, right?
Absolutely critical. This immense scale required sophisticated new ways of cooperating effectively among millions of strangers who would never meet. And the book shows how codified imagined orders were created precisely for this purpose. Laws, myths, religions, social hierarchies.
Like Hammurabi's Code.
Hammurabi's Code from ancient Babylon is a perfect example. It wasn't just a list of laws. It asserted a rigid hierarchical social order. It explicitly distinguished between superior people, Olalim, commoners, Mushkenim, and slaves, Wardum. And it assigned different values and legal rights to each group.
Different values, how so?
Well, a chilling example the book gives. If one superior man killed another superior man's daughter, the killer's own daughter was executed as punishment.
Oh my God. Not the killer himself.
No, his daughter. To our modern sensibilities, that seems horrific, completely unjust. But to Hammurabi and the Babylonians, it seemed perfectly just because it meticulously maintained the social hierarchy. It upheld the principle that the value of a superior man's daughter was equivalent to another superior man's daughter.
It preserved the order.
Exactly. It enabled an empire of 1 million inhabitants to cooperate, produce food, defend themselves, expand. Because everyone, supposedly, knew their place and the rules, however unequal.
So what does this profound insight into Hammurabi's Code mean for us today? It seems so alien.
Harari contrasts it directly with, say, the American Declaration of Independence, with its famous assertion that all men are created equal.
Right, a cornerstone of modern Western thought.
But he immediately points out that if you translate that statement into biological terms, it would more accurately read something like, all men evolve differently, they're born with certain mutable characteristics, and they're certainly not biologically identical or equal in abilities.
Ouch, that's blunt.
It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that our own cherished imagined orders, like the belief in universal equality, are not objectively true based on biological reality. Instead, we believe in them precisely because they enable vast cooperation and, ideally, a stable society. Even the American order, championing liberty, still implicitly consecrated hierarchies, particularly between rich and poor, often believing wealth directly reflected merit, despite, inheritance and luck playing huge roles.
So the imagined order serves a function, even if it's not true in a scientific sense.
Exactly. And this is a critical point Harari makes. Hammurabi, despite his rigid code, could have used the exact same underlying logic as the framers of the American Declaration. He could have thought, look, I know that superiors, commoners, and slaves are inherently different biologically, but believing they are, accepting this hierarchy, enables a stable and prosperous society for everyone.
So imagined orders aren't just evil conspiracies.
No, not usually. They're not just useless mirages. Harari argues they are, in fact, the only way large numbers of humans can cooperate effectively beyond the intimate tribal level. They provide the shared script. However, and this is key, unlike the law of gravity, which works whether you believe in it or not, imagined orders are always fragile. They're always in danger of collapsing because they depend entirely on collective belief.
If enough people stop believing, the order falls apart.
Precisely. Which requires continuous and strenuous efforts to safeguard and reinforce them. Propaganda, education, rituals, but often also violence and coercion.
Like the American Civil War.
A prime example, fought in large part to enforce the imagined order of liberty and union, specifically regarding the status of slaves, after a majority concluded they were indeed human beings included in all men are created equal. Maintaining belief often requires force.
The book applies this idea of imagined orders to other persistent hierarchies too, right? Like rich and poor or racial hierarchies.
Yes, very powerfully. While most modern Westerners would rightly find historical racial hierarchies abhorrent laws preventing black people from living in white neighborhoods or attending white schools, the rich-poor divide, with its de facto separate neighborhoods, schools, and social circles, often seems perfectly sensible, even natural to many people today in America and Europe.
Even though wealth is often just inherited.
Exactly. The book points out that inconvenient fact that wealth is very often simply passed down, rather than being purely a reward for individual merit or hard work. Yet the hierarchy persists and is widely accepted as reflecting some kind of natural order.
How do these hierarchies get maintained then, besides just belief?
What's truly fascinating here is how concepts of purity and impurity have been systematically harnessed throughout history to enforce social divisions. These concepts seem rooted in primal biological survival mechanisms, like our revulsion towards potential disease carriers, rotting food, feces, things that could actually harm us.
Okay, that makes sense biologically.
But this biological instinct has been co-opted culturally, from the ancient Hindu caste system where even indirect contact with someone from a lower, impure caste could pollute you, to the American racial hierarchy, where black people were unjustly labeled not just as inferior, unreliable, lazy, less intelligent, but crucially as agents of pollution who could somehow corrupt white society through contact or intermarriage.
So fear of contamination becomes a tool for social control.
A very powerful, almost subconscious tool. These deeply ingrained myths about purity and pollution help perpetuate chance historical events or power imbalances into cruel, rigid social structures that feel almost biologically mandated.
And the book tackles gender hierarchy as well.
Oh yes, extensively. It rigorously dismisses common biological explanations, often trotted out, for why women haven't historically held dominant positions of power. Things like supposed physical weakness or lower aggression levels due to testosterone.
Arguments you still hear sometimes.
You do, but Harari points out that managing a war or running an empire often requires organizational genius, strategic cooperation, diplomacy, appeasement, not just brute strength. Qualities women are arguably often stereotyped as possessing more than aggressive men.
Good point. Emperor Augustus wasn't exactly a great warrior, was he?
Not at all. Famously militarily incompetent, but he built a stable empire through calculated clemency, political maneuvering, alliances, not battlefield prowess alone. The patriarchal genes theory suggesting men and women evolved fundamentally different reproductive and social strategies leading to male dominance is also challenged. Harari points to numerous matriarchal or female-dominated animal societies, like elephants or bonobo chimpanzees.
Bonobos, right. Very different social structure.
Very. Females develop strong cooperative networks. Males are often less cooperative, more self-centered. It shows that biology doesn't automatically dictate patriarchy across the board, even in our close primate relatives.
So what's the conclusion on hierarchies then?
If we connect this all together, Harari's central argument is pretty stark. Most sociopolitical hierarchies that we often take for granted, class, race, gender, lack any sound logical or biological basis. They are, quite simply, nothing but the perpetuation of chance events supported by myths, historical accidents solidified by powerful stories.
And that's why studying history is important.
Exactly. He argues that's one good reason to study history. If the sharp divisions into, say, blacks and whites in America or Brahmins and Shudras in India were truly grounded in biological realities, then biology alone could explain them. But since the biological differences between different groups of Homo sapiens are actually negligible, biology cannot explain the intricate, often cruel dynamics of caste society or racial segregation.
We need history for that.
We must study the specific events, circumstances, and insidious power relations that transform these figments of imagination into cruel and very real social structures. Like that ancient Hebrew law allowing a rapist to claim his virgin victim as his wife if he just paid her father 50 shekels of silver, treating her as literal property. History reveals how these imagined orders became concrete, often brutal, realities.
Okay, that's a lot to take in about how societies got structured. Let's shift gears a bit. We've covered the cognitive and agricultural revolutions, changing how sapiens lived and cooperated internally. Now, how did humanity start to unify into what Harari calls a global village, overcoming that fragmentation where you had separate worlds in Mesoamerica, the Andes, Australia?
Right, these completely isolated human networks for millennia. Three major forces drove this unification, according to the book: money, empires, and universal religions. Let's start with money.
Money seems obvious, but why was it so revolutionary?
Well, think about the sheer inefficiency of a barter economy, which dominated early trade. Harari calculates that if just 100 different commodities are being traded, buyers and sellers need to know an astonishing 4,950 different exchange rates. Commodity A for B, A for C, B for C, and so on.
Wow, that's complicated.
Totally impractical. Plus, you constantly need that double coincidence of once the shoemaker needs apples and the apple grower happens to need shoes right now, right here.
Yeah, what if the apple grower needs pottery?
Exactly. What if the shoemaker needs a divorce and the lawyer needs a haircut? It quickly becomes an intractable problem for anything beyond simple local exchange. Money, Harari argues, elegantly solves this. He defines it brilliantly as the most universal and most efficient system of mutual trust ever devised.
Mutual trust, not just a medium of exchange.
But trust is key. It's people's willingness to trust the shared belief in the value of something, whether it's a shell, a barley sack, a coin, or a digital entry that makes it work. Often the thing itself has little or no intrinsic value.
And what's truly remarkable is how consistent this idea of money has been across vastly different cultures and times.
Incredibly consistent. From barley money in ancient Sumer, where salaries were literally paid in silas, or liters of barley, to the first standardized coins, the Lydian gold and silver pieces, around the 7th century BC, like the Roman denarius, which then became the Arabic dinar, and eventually a generic name for coins across vast empires. Money's evolution shows this striking universality.
Even places like China, which developed its own system with bronze coins and unmarked silver ingots, eventually linked into this emerging global monetary system, didn't they?
They did. It allowed for increasingly extensive complex trade connections across immense distances, linking economies that had previously been totally separate.
Which brings up that trust issue again.
Yeah.
Why did Chinese, Indians, Muslims, Spaniards, people from vastly different cultures, often enemies, all come to trust something like gold?
Yeah, it's a profound question. Economists might give you answers about supply and demand, portability, durability, intrinsic value. But the deeper answer, Harari argues, goes back to imagined realities. People are willing to trust figments of their collective imagination. Money isn't just a practical tool. It's a profound system of shared belief in something that might just be shiny metal or a piece of paper. Gold is valuable, ultimately, because everyone believes it's valuable.
It's a testament to the power of our shared fictions again.
Absolutely. Making it one of humanity's most successful inventions for enabling cooperation on an unprecedented global scale.
But the book also talks about a tension, right, between money and values.
Yes, a constant tension. Harari describes the economic history of humankind as this delicate dance. We rely absolutely on money to facilitate cooperation with strangers, to enable global trade, complex economies. Yet simultaneously, we often fear it. We worry it will corrupt human values, erode intimate relationships, turn everything into a commodity.
Yeah, the idea that money cheapens things.
Exactly. We might tear down communal dams, traditions, relationships, ethics for the sake of commerce and profit, but then we constantly try to build new ones, laws, regulations, ethical codes to protect society, religion, the environment from the unrestrained forces of the market.
So it's a push and pull.
Constantly. The idea that the market always prevails is, as Harari points out, remarkably naive. History is full of examples where warriors, religious fanatics, concerned citizens have managed to trounce calculating merchants and fundamentally reshape economies. The unification of humankind wasn't just an economic process driven by money. Military power steel, as Jared Diamond might put it, played an equally crucial role through empires.
Okay, so empires are the second great unifier. How does Harari define an empire? It's not just about size, is it?
No, not just size or military conquest. He defines an empire primarily by two key characteristics. First, it rules over a significant number of distinct peoples, each with its own cultural identity and separate territory. Cultural diversity is key. And second, it has flexible borders and a potentially unlimited appetite for expansion. An empire, in his view, is a political order capable of absorbing more and more peoples and territories without fundamentally changing its basic structure or identity.
So the British Empire fits, obviously, but maybe ancient Rome, too.
Absolutely. Rome started as a small city-state, but eventually ruled diverse peoples across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The British Empire, the largest in history, ultimately came to be ruled by a democracy, not a single autocrat, showing that flexibility.
Now, what's fascinating is how the book challenges common modern views of empires. We tend to think of them quite negatively now.
We do. Harari tackles two common modern statements head-on. Empires are impossible to maintain, and empires are inherently evil.
Okay, how does he debunk those?
Well, the first one, empires are impossible, is just historically nonsense, he argues. Empires have actually been the world's most common and often most stable form of political organization for at least 2,500 years, far more common than small, independent nation-states.
Right. Empires were the norm for a long time.
For a very long time. And they're often incredibly effective at absorbing conquered peoples, sometimes brutally, sometimes gradually, until their distinct cultures simply fizzled out and became part of the broader imperial identity. He gives the example of modern Spanish patriots. They might admire the ancient Celtic Numantians for resisting Rome, but they speak a language descended from Rome's Latin, follow a Roman-rooted Catholic Church, and use legal principles derived from Roman law. It powerfully shows how victors, over centuries, completely co-opted the very memory and identity of the vanquished. The imperial culture became their culture.
Wow. And this legacy isn't just about high culture, is it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Imperial legacies are deeply embedded in our everyday lives, often in ways we don't even think about. Most people on Earth today speak, think, and dream in imperial languages, languages that were often forced upon their ancestors by conquest. Think of English, Spanish, Portuguese, French in the Americas, or Arabic across North Africa and the Middle East, or Russian, or Chinese.
Yeah, good point.
Even groups who fiercely resisted empires often end up adopting their legacy. He mentions the 10 million Zulus in South Africa today, proudly harking back to the Zulu Empire's age of glory in the 19th century. Despite the fact that most of them likely descend from tribes who fought against Shaka Zulu in the expansion of his empire, the imperial past gets reimagined and embraced.
That's ironic. And empires spread culture, but not just their own culture.
Right, they were massive melting pots. The cultural ideas spread by empires weren't exclusive to the ruling elite. In fact, their universal and often inclusive vision, the idea that the empire was for everyone, eventually made it easy for imperial elites to adopt ideas, technologies, customs, even religions from the peoples they conquered.
So they absorbed as well as imposed.
Absolutely. Roman culture became deeply Hellenized, absorbing Greek philosophy, art, literature. Abbasid Islamic culture was a vibrant synthesis of Persian, Greek, and Arab influences. Imperial Mongol culture, despite its nomadic roots, copied extensively from the sophisticated traditions of conquered China. This remarkable tendency to absorb and hybridize cultures makes empires incredibly powerful engines of cultural exchange and ultimately unification, spreading ideas across vast territories.
And does he see this unification continuing today, even without formal empires?
He does. Even though the world is politically fragmented into nearly 200 supposedly independent states, these states are rapidly losing actual sovereignty. They're losing independence to global markets, powerful multinational corporations, international NGOs, global public opinion, and international legal systems.
Like the World Trade Organization or the International Criminal Court.
Exactly. Nations are increasingly obliged to conform to global standards of financial behavior, environmental policy, human rights, justice, whether they like it or not. Immensely powerful currents of capital, labor, and information flow across borders with increasing ease, largely disregarding national boundaries. It suggests a continued, if different, form of unification toward a single global society, a single imagined order. The idea of a truly independent nation-state is becoming more fiction than reality.
Okay, so money and empires as unifiers. What's the third one?
Religion, another incredibly powerful force for unification, creating and reinforcing these grand imagined orders that can bind millions, even billions of people together.
How does the book define religion? It seems broader than just belief in God.
It is broader. The definition Harari uses is a system of human norms and values that is founded on belief in a superhuman order.
Superhuman order. What does that mean exactly?
It means an order not created by humans, something beyond our control that dictates rules or laws we must follow. It could be the will of gods, or it could be natural laws. So this definition is crucial because it expands our understanding. By this metric, it means not just Islam or Christianity or Judaism are religions, but also Buddhism, Taoism, Stoicism, and even modern ideologies like communism, capitalism, liberal humanism, and nationalism are considered religions.
Communism as a religion, how?
Because it's a comprehensive system of norms and values, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, founded on belief in a superhuman order, namely the immutable Marxist laws of history, which supposedly dictate an inevitable societal progression towards communism.
Okay, I see the logic. So it's about belief in unbreakable non-human laws or rules.
Exactly. By contrast, Einstein's theory of relativity isn't a religion because no specific human norms or values are founded directly on its principles. And football isn't a religion because its rules, while religiously followed by some fans maybe, don't reflect superhuman edicts. They're just human agreements.
That's a useful distinction. Now, Harari talks about the incredible spread of monotheism, right? Belief in one God.
Yes, its spread was historically explosive. At the beginning of the 1st century A.D., monotheists were a tiny, obscure minority, mostly Jews in the Levant. Yet by the early 16th century, monotheism, primarily Christianity and Islam, dominated most of Afro-Asia, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and was rapidly extending its reach to other continents via European expansion. Empires from Spain to India claimed to be ordained by a single great god, profoundly shaping the global political, social, and cultural order for centuries.
But it wasn't always a smooth transition, was it? The book talks about complexities.
Oh, absolutely not. There's always this persistent chasm between neat theological theories and the messy realities of history and human psychology. Most people, Harari notes, found it remarkably hard to fully digest the pure monotheistic idea of a single, all-powerful, somewhat remote god.
So they brought back other figures.
Often, yeah. They reintroduced intermediaries, you could say. Think of saints in Catholicism, or Sufi mystics in Islam, or various bodhisattvas in Mahayana Buddhism, which itself evolved from a non-theistic philosophy. People seem to crave more accessible, specialized, superhuman powers. And the enduring problem of evil, how can an all-good, all-powerful God allow so much suffering, led to the persistent appeal of dualism.
Dualism, like God versus the devil.
Exactly. The idea that there's a powerful, independent evil force, Satan, Ahriman, who can act against God's will and wreak havoc. This helps explain evil, but it creates its own theological headache, the problem of order.
Problem of order.
Yeah. If good and evil are locked in this cosmic battle, what higher laws govern this war? Who decreed those laws? Monotheism insists God decreed everything, but dualism struggles with that ultimate authority. While explicitly dualist creeds like Manichaeism eventually faded, Harari argues that mainstream Jewish, Christian, and Muslim monotheism absorbed numerous dualist beliefs and practices. The devil remains a potent figure.
And the book even applies this religion lens to something like Nazism. That seems controversial.
It is provocative, but consistent with his definition. He argues Nazism functioned as a natural law religion, not worshiping gods, but believing in supposed immutable laws of nature, specifically regarding race and evolution. Its main ambition, chillingly, was framed as protecting humankind from degeneration and encouraging progressive evolution. They believed the Aryan race was biologically superior and that other groups, Jews, Roma, homosexuals, disabled people, were degenerate kinds of Homo Sapiens who needed to be quarantined, sterilized, or even exterminated for the supposed good of humanity's future evolution.
That's horrifying. Presenting genocide as beneficial.
Utterly horrifying. Yet it was presented as being beneficial for the human species, according to their twisted natural laws. Of course, like many religions, it was ultimately beneficial mainly to itself and its own propagation, justifying unimaginable cruelty through its superhuman claims.
And these ideas weren't totally fringe at the time.
That's the deeply uncomfortable part. While biologists have since thoroughly and unequivocally debunked Nazi racial theory, the book points out that given the state of scientific knowledge and widespread prejudice in the 1930s, these beliefs were hardly outside the pale of mainstream, even respected thought in the West.
Really? Belief in white superiority was common.
Disturbingly common.
Yeah.
The existence of distinct human races, the inherent superiority of the white race, and the supposed need to cultivate superior races through eugenics were widely held beliefs among Western elites. Respected scholars in prestigious universities published studies allegedly proving these ideas. Politicians in so-called Aryan countries like the USA, Canada, and Australia enacted immigration policies explicitly based on these racist and eugenic concepts, aiming to keep out inferior stock.
Wow. That puts it in a different context.
It's a dark chapter reminding us how easily seemingly scientific justifications can be twisted to bolster cruel and discriminatory ideologies. It highlights the absolute need for constant ethical vigilance within science and society.
Okay. Before we move on to the scientific revolution itself, there's a really interesting point the book makes about contradictions within cultures.
Yes, the idea that contradictions aren't necessarily bad.
Right. Just like medieval knights struggled to reconcile Christian humility with chivalric honor, the modern world constantly struggles to square values like liberty and equality. They often pull in opposite directions.
True. Or equality and individual freedom.
But Harari argues this isn't a defect in our culture.
No, quite the opposite. What's truly fascinating here is his argument that such contradictions, such cognitive dissonance, are an inseparable part of every human culture. In fact, he posits they are culture's engines. They are fundamentally responsible for our species' remarkable creativity and dynamism.
How can contradictions drive creativity?
Think of it like music. Just as two clashing musical notes create tension that drives a piece forward, makes it interesting, propels it, discord in our thoughts, ideas, and values compels us to think. It forces us to reevaluate, to criticize, to try and resolve the tension. And in that process of grappling with contradictions, we innovate, we change, we evolve culturally.
So trying to reconcile liberty and equality forces new political ideas.
Exactly. As the book famously states, consistency is the playground of dull minds. It's the inherent tension within our belief systems, the internal arguments that truly drives progress and change, rather than some smooth, consistent ideology hindering it.
That's a powerful and maybe, unsettling thought that our contradictions are actually our strength. Okay, now let's shift focus to the last 500 years or so, a period where humanity has seen this phenomenal, completely unprecedented growth in power.
Explosive growth. The numbers are staggering.
Right. In 1500, there were maybe 500 million Homo sapiens globally. Today, over 7 billion, approaching 8.
14-fold increase.
The total value of goods and services produced annually, maybe $250 billion in 1500, in today's money. Now, around $60 trillion.
A 240-fold increase.
Unbelievable. And energy consumption. From about 13 trillion calories per day in 1500 to a mind-boggling 1,500 trillion today.
115 times more energy use.
This explosive growth is largely thanks to the scientific revolution, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which Harari frames as being fundamentally about discovering new knowledge, but also about harnessing new powers.
Yes, the link between knowledge and power is central. Modern science, he argues, differs radically from all previous traditions of knowledge in three critical ways.
Okay, what are they?
First, and maybe most important, is its willingness to admit ignorance. Summed up by the Latin word ignoramus, we do not know. Unlike older traditions that often claim to have all the important answers already in scriptures, ancient texts, etc., modern science starts by saying, we don't know everything. No concept is sacred. Anything can be questioned and potentially proven wrong by evidence.
That humility is key.
Foundational. Second, building on that, modern science accepts that observation and mathematics are the primary tools to gain new knowledge. It prioritizes empirical evidence and mathematical modeling over tradition or scripture. And third, and perhaps most crucially for its impact, science doesn't just aim for knowledge. It aims to use that knowledge to acquire new powers, new technologies, new capabilities.
To change the world, not just understand it.
Precisely. He gives the example of those Presbyterian clergymen back in 1744 Scotland. They used statistical predictions about death rates, a mathematical tool applied to human life to set up the first modern life insurance fund for widows and orphans.
Applying math to predict death.
Wow. It demonstrated how mathematical reasoning, born from admitting ignorance about the future but observing patterns, could be applied to human affairs to create new social technologies, new forms of security. This focus on observation and mathematics is why, say, psychology or economics courses today are full of statistics, a concept that would have utterly bewildered Confucius or Buddha or Jesus. They wouldn't have seen math as key to understanding the human mind or society.
So it's this fusion of admitting ignorance, ignoramuses, and seeking new powers that gives science its immense prestige today.
Largely, yes. Its ability to deliver the goods, to give us incredible new tools and capabilities from antibiotics and smartphones to nuclear bombs, earns it enormous authority.
But the direct link between pure science and practical technology, that wasn't always the case, was it?
No, that's a surprisingly recent phenomenon. The idea that breakthroughs in a lab immediately translate into useful tools or weapons really only solidified in the 19th century, and especially the 20th. Before about 1850, the link was much weaker. Rulers and businesses rarely funded pure scientific research, expecting immediate practical payoffs. Science was often seen as a gentlemanly pursuit.
When did that change?
World War I was a major turning point. Scientists were directly mobilized by governments on an unprecedented scale to develop wonder weapons, poison gas, tanks, better artillery, submarines. It starkly demonstrated the lethal power that could come from systematically applying scientific knowledge to military and industrial problems.
Yeah.
From then on, the marriage of science, industry, and military power became inseparable.
And this quest for new powers marked a real shift in mindset, too.
A profound shift. Before modern science, most cultures had myths and religious stories like the Tower of Babel or Icarus flying too close to the sun that warned against humans trying to exceed their natural limitations. Such attempts were seen as hubris, likely to incur divine punishment.
Don't try to play God.
Exactly. But once modern culture embraced ignorance, we don't know the limits, and explicitly linked scientific discovery with acquiring new powers, people started to think, hey, maybe real unlimited progress is possible after all. The ancient dream of overcoming death itself, what Harari calls the Gilgamesh Project, after the Mesopotamian hero who sought immortality transformed from a mythical quest for meaning in death to a potentially achievable technical problem to be solved by science.
The idea that we could actually conquer death.
Or at least dramatically postpone it. It's a fundamental shift in ambition.
And it's hard for us now to grasp just how pervasive death and disease were even relatively recently.
Almost impossible to truly imagine. As recently as the 19th century, doctors routinely performed amputations without any anesthetics. Just hold the patient down and saw. Think of the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Historical accounts describe literal heaps of sawn-off hands and legs piled outside the field hospitals. Anesthetics like ether and chloroform only became common in the mid-19th century. Before that, surgery was butchery, endured only in the most desperate circumstances. And consider Eleanor of Castile, Queen of England in the 13th century. She had 16 children, trying desperately to secure a male heir. Many of them died tragically young from childhood diseases we barely worry about today.
Even for royalty, life was incredibly precarious.
Absolutely. It highlights the pervasive presence of death, disease, and medical helplessness, even for the wealthiest and most powerful, underscoring just how revolutionary modern medicine truly is, despite its own challenges.
Now this brings us back to empires. Why did this scientific revolution, this drive for knowledge and power, really take off in Europe?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Harari offers a compelling, if perhaps controversial, argument. Modern science flourished hand-in-hand with European imperialism. They fueled each other. Well, consider Captain James Cook's famous voyages in the late 18th century. Was his expedition a scientific expedition protected by a military force? Or was it a military expedition with a few scientists tagging along?
Good question. Probably both.
Harari asserts it was profoundly both. The science and the imperialism were inseparable. Cook's botanists discovered hundreds of new species, his astronomers made crucial observations, but his discovery of an effective treatment for scurvy, using sauerkraut, greatly aided the British Navy's ability to control the world's oceans and project power.
Okay, practical benefit for the empire.
And Cook himself claimed vast territories for Britain, Australia, New Zealand, often leading directly, as the book notes, to the extermination of native cultures and the subjugation of indigenous peoples. The key, Harari argues, was a shared mindset between the scientists and the conquerors. Both started by admitting ignorance, I don't know what's out there. And both deeply hoped that acquiring new knowledge, whether geographical, botanical, anthropological, or military, would ultimately make them and their nation masters of the world. Exploration and exploitation went hand in hand.
Is there an example that really shows this unique European mindset?
Columbus is a powerful one. He sailed west believing in old, complete world maps, wildly miscalculating the distance to Asia. He thought Japan was only 7,000 kilometers away.
When it was actually like 20,000 kilometers plus a whole continent in between.
Exactly. But his willingness to admit the map might be wrong, to sail into the unknown, to literally collide with the unknown continent in 1492, epitomizes this European drive to explore and conquer based on acknowledging ignorance.
Compared to, say, the Chinese expeditions.
Right. Zheng, his huge Chinese fleets, reached East Africa in the early 15th century, decades before Columbus, with vastly superior ships and technology. They could have easily sailed around Africa and discovered Europe, or sailed east and found America.
But they didn't.
They didn't. They showed incredible capability, but apparently no comparable, insatiable ambition to explore and conquer unknown territories or fundamentally change their worldview based on new discoveries. They explored, traded, demanded tribute, and went home. The first world map published in China that actually showed America accurately appeared only in 1602, and it was drawn by a European missionary. It highlights a difference in mentality.
And this willingness to confront the unknown even against odds.
It was crucial. Think of Cortez conquering the Aztec Empire with just 550 Spaniards, or Pizarro taking down the Incas with even fewer. Their audacity, their willingness to gamble everything based on incomplete knowledge and the potential for power, was key. The Aztecs and Incas, faced with these utterly alien invaders, deliberated, negotiated, couldn't fathom their intentions or ruthlessness, initially even wondering if they were gods or demons. That hesitation proved fatal against the single-minded European drive.
And science also provided justification for empire.
An ideological justification, yes. The constant stream of new knowledge, new discoveries, new technologies flowing back from the colonies helped brand the empires themselves as progressive and positive enterprises. They weren't just conquering, they were supposedly bringing enlightenment, civilization, and scientific advancement to the rest of the world. It was a convenient narrative.
Like mapping and classifying everything.
Exactly. Scholars like William Jones, who pioneered comparative linguistics while working for the British East India Company in India, exemplify this. His academic study, presented as pure intellectual pursuit, directly served imperial administration by helping understand and therefore control the conquered population. Histories of science, like botany or geography, often praise the European explorers like Cook and his botanist Joseph Banks for their contributions, while conveniently omitting or downplaying the immense suffering and subjugation their expeditions invariably brought to native populations whose lands and lives were being discovered and categorized. Science could be used to legitimize conquest.
Okay. So the scientific revolution, intertwined with empire, unlocked new knowledge and ambitions, and this fueled the next huge transformation, the Industrial Revolution.
Right, which Harari frames fundamentally as a revolution in energy conversion.
Energy conversion, yeah.
Leading to that massive increase in energy consumption we talked about earlier. It was all about finding exponentially better ways to harness and convert energy to do work, finding better pumps for energy.
How did that shift happen?
Well, for millennia, humans primarily relied on the energy stored in plants burning wood for heat, using wind, acting on plant-based sails, or flowing water channeled by human effort for mechanical power. Plus, human and animal muscle power, also fueled by plants. But these sources had clear limits. You ran out of trees, the wind isn't always blowing, water power is location-dependent. Growth was limited by the immediate energy budget of the ecosystem.
Right, the green energy reservoir.
Exactly, relying on the sun's daily energy capture by plants. The first key breakthrough in converting heat directly into movement was gunpowder, invented in 9th century China. But it took 600 years before effective artillery really changed warfare.
And then the steam engine.
The steam engine was the true game changer. Born around 1700, initially out of the very practical need to pump water out of flooded British coal mines as they ran out of wood. This subtle noise of the first inefficient steam engines gradually grew into a deafening cacophony that enveloped the world. It signaled a monumental shift. Humanity learned how to tap into the enormous ocean of energy stored in fossil fuels, coal, then oil, then natural gas, essentially unlocking millions of years of accumulated, concentrated sunlight.
A completely different energy scale.
Unprecedented. This fundamental shift unlocked unimaginable power and fundamentally reshaped human society and our relationship with the planet.
And the Industrial Revolution, fueled by this energy and scientific know-how, had profound consequences. Not always positive, especially for animals.
Devastatingly so, for billions of animals. The book details what it calls the tragedy of industrial agriculture, where billions upon billions of farm animals, chickens, pigs, cattle, live out their short, miserable lives as cogs in a mechanized assembly line. Treated like machines, not sentient beings, with some 50 billion land animals slaughtered globally every single year for food.
50 billion a year, that's astronomical.
It's hard to even comprehend the scale. And this raises a crucial ethical question Harari explores. We take meticulous care of these animals' objective needs, right? We ensure they have sufficient food, water, shelter, maybe even inoculations against disease because that maximizes production.
Right, keeps them alive and growing.
But we almost entirely neglect their subjective needs. Those fundamental instincts and desires shaped over millions of years of evolution in the wild.
Like what kind of needs?
Like a calf's innate urge to bond with its mother, play with other calves, or a pig's deep-seated need to root around in the soil, explore its environment, or a chicken's instinct to scratch, peck, establish a social order.
Needs that don't fit the factory farm model.
Not at all. He mentions Harry Harlow's famous and ethically controversial 1950s studies with infant monkeys.
The wire mother experiments.
Yeah. They showed monkeys consistently clung desperately to a soft cloth mother for comfort and psychological security, even when a bare wire mother was the one providing milk from a bottle. They needed comfort more than just calories.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. And Harari argues this basic lesson of evolutionary psychology applies to all mammals and birds. Emotional and social needs shaped in the wild continue to be felt subjectively, deeply, even if they are no longer strictly necessary for physical survival in an artificial industrial setting. This profound disconnect between objective survival and subjective suffering is the tragedy playing out daily in factory farms worldwide. A massive, often invisible cost of our cheap meat and efficient progress.
And this industrial agriculture, it also enabled the urban revolution, right?
Absolutely. By allowing a drastically shrinking number of farmers to feed a rapidly growing global population. For example, in the U.S. today, something like only 2% of the population works in agriculture, yet they feed the entire nation and export massive surpluses.
With incredible efficiency.
Incredible. This efficiency freed up countless hands and brains, from farm labor to staff the burgeoning factories, mines, and offices of the new urban landscape. Without this preceding agricultural intensification, the urban industrial revolution simply couldn't have happened on the scale that it did.
And this new industrial capitalist economy, it needed people to buy all the stuff being produced.
Constantly. The modern capitalist economy, driven by the principles of the Industrial Revolution and fueled by credit, needs constant, unending growth. It's like a shark, Harari says, that must constantly swim forward or suffocate. Production must always increase.
So how do you ensure people keep buying more stuff?
A new, powerful ethic had to emerge. Consumerism.
Consumerism as an ethic.
Yes. Historically, in most cultures, frugality, thrift, asceticism, saving these were often seen as virtues. Denying yourself immediate gratification was good.
Right, don't be wasteful.
But consumerism actively encourages the opposite. It promotes overconsumption, indulgence, treating yourself as a core tenet of the good life. Buy now, pay later. Instant gratification. He uses a great quote from an Israeli cereal box. Telma cereals treats without remorse. That perfectly encapsulates this profound shift from saving to spending, from self-denial to guilt-free self-indulgence.
Treats without remorse.
This new capitalist consumerist ideology even cleverly intertwined itself with romanticism, which emphasizes varied experiences and novelty. This created the infinite market of experiences: tourism, exotic foods, extreme sports. Where a trip to Paris or trekking in Nepal is marketed not just as a vacation, but as a vital personal experience to be consumed for self-fulfillment and identity building. We buy experiences now, not just things.
The age of shopping, as the book calls it, and it changed our relationship with time, too.
Dramatically. The Industrial Revolution, with its factories and machines, imposed the rigid timetable and the logic of the assembly line onto nearly all aspects of human activity. From the factory floor, it spread to schools, hospitals, government offices, transportation. Precise schedules and punctuality became paramount. Efficiency ruled.
Everything runs by the clock.
Everything. This required the ubiquitous presence of cheap, precise clocks, which are now literally everywhere on our wrists, phones, computers, walls, microwaves, making it, as Harari quips, a conscious effort not to know what time it is.
True.
Think about it. A medieval city might have had one notoriously inaccurate public clock tower. Today, a single affluent family probably owns more and far more accurate timepieces than an entire medieval country possessed. This relentless ticking fundamentally altered our perception and experience of time itself.
But all this efficiency, this individualism, it came at a social cost.
A huge social cost. This is one of those profound impacts Harari discusses. the collapse of traditional family and community structures.
How did industry break those down?
Well, prior to the Industrial Revolution, for most people throughout history, daily life revolved almost entirely around the nuclear family, the extended family, and the local tight-knit community. These intimate groups provided almost everything: economic support, healthcare, education, elder care, childcare, social life, even basic law enforcement and conflict resolution. Kings and distant governments largely stayed out of these intimate daily affairs.
The village or the neighborhood took care of things.
Pretty much. But within just 2 centuries, the combined forces of the Industrial Revolution, the market economy, and the expanding state broke these traditional building blocks into atoms. Functions that families and communities had performed for millennia were systematically handed over to impersonal states and market schools run by the state, healthcare by professionals and institutions, welfare by government agencies, entertainment by commercial enterprises.
So we became more individualistic.
Yes. This liberation of the individual from the constraints of traditional family and community brought new freedoms, absolutely. More choice, more mobility. But it came at the profound cost of feeling potentially more alienated, threatened, and isolated. We lost the built-in support networks. And it made it far harder for atomized individuals to collectively resist the immense, centralized power of the modern state and market.
If your neighbors are strangers, it's hard to organize.
Exactly. When neighbors in a high-rise apartment building, as Harari puts it, maybe can't even agree on how much to pay their janitor, how can we expect them to effectively stand up together against the power of a centralized state or a massive corporation?
So what replaced the intimate community?
To compensate for this profound loss, markets and states actively foster imagined communities on a much larger scale.
Imagined communities again, like nations.
Nations are the prime example, but also things like global consumer tribes, fans of a certain brand or music, political movements, online communities, millions of strangers who don't know each other personally, but imagine they share a common identity, history, and destiny.
Kingdoms and churches used these ideas before, right?
For millennia, yes. But in the modern era, these vast imagined communities, particularly the nation and the state, have largely taken primacy over the smaller, intimate communities that once fulfilled our core emotional needs and ensured our basic survival. Our loyalty shifted. He uses the example of Saddam Hussein trying to forge an Iraqi nation by claiming the heritage of the ancient Abbasid Caliphate and even the Babylonian Empire. But, as Harari says, baking a cake for ingredients you bought 2 months ago doesn't make the cake 2 months old. The age of the historical ingredients doesn't automatically transfer legitimacy to the newly constructed entity.
Interesting analogy. Now, despite all this upheaval, alienation, destructive power, the book presents a truly surprising trend regarding violence.
Yeah, this is one of the most counterintuitive but well-supported arguments in the later part of the book. The dramatic decline of human violence, especially since World War II.
Decline? Really? With everything we see in the news?
Relatively speaking, yes. The data is pretty stark. In 2002, for instance, Harari notes that far more people worldwide died by suicide, around 873,000, than died from the combined results of war and violent crime, around 741,000.
More suicide than murder and war combined. Wow.
And the ancient law of the jungle, the historical norm where a plausible war between any 2 adjacent kingdoms or tribes within the next year was almost always a possibility, has been fundamentally broken in most parts of the world.
We don't expect France and Germany to go to war anymore.
Exactly. Or the U.S. and Canada. Most empires since 1945, rather than collapsing into bloody civil wars and fragmentation as they historically did, opted for relatively peaceful early retirement. Think of the British, French, Soviet empires. Messy, yes, but not the centuries of warfare that followed Rome's collapse. Full-scale wars between major global powers are now considered almost apocalyptic scenarios, thankfully, not routine political tools. This makes peace, by historical standards, genuinely real in many regions, not just a temporary absence of conflict.
So exceptions exist, but the overall trend is down.
That's the argument. While tragic conflicts certainly still erupt, like in Ukraine or between specific rivals like Israel and its neighbors, or potential flashpoints like Taiwan, these are increasingly seen as deviations from a global trend of declining large-scale violence rather than the historical norm. It's a remarkable, if fragile, achievement.
Okay, so we've journeyed through these revolutions, seen our collective power surge, economies grow, even violence decline. But this brings us to maybe the deepest question the book asks, one historians often avoid. Did any of this actually make us happier?
Right. Did we actually decrease suffering or increase well-being for the average individual sapiens along the way?
Right.
Were citizens in the bustling cities of ancient Uruk or Babylon truly happier, more content than their hunter-gatherer ancestors? Did the rise of Islam genuinely make Egyptians more pleased with their lives overall?
It's a fundamental question about the true measure of progress, isn't it? Beyond just GDP or technological might.
Absolutely. And it directly challenges that common, almost automatic progressive view that increased capabilities, wealth, and health automatically equate to greater happiness.
Because the evidence suggests otherwise.
The evidence is ambiguous at best and often suggests the opposite, especially for certain periods. As we've discussed, the agricultural revolution, while increasing collective human power and population size, arguably made daily life harsher and more miserable for many individuals chained to back-breaking labor and vulnerable to famine and disease.
Right.
And empires, while fostering cultural exchange and increasing collective power, often caused immense suffering, exploitation, and injustice, not only to other animals but also to vast, conquered human populations. So the simple narrative that we are necessarily happier, more fulfilled than our ancestors just because we have more stuff or live longer is, in the book's words, unconvincing. Progress in power hasn't automatically translated to progress in well-being.
This is a pretty bleak assessment of history in a way.
Yeah.
So if objective conditions like wealth and health don't guarantee happiness, what does?
This is where it gets really counterintuitive for many of us. Harari argues, based on psychological research and philosophical reflection, that happiness doesn't seem to depend much on objective conditions at all. Instead, it hinges almost entirely on the correlation between objective conditions and subjective expectations.
Expectations.
Yeah, it's about the gap between what you have and what you want or expect to have. If you desire a simple, reliable bullet card and you manage to get one, you're likely to feel pretty content.
Okay.
But if you desperately crave a brand new Ferrari and you only manage to acquire a decent secondhand Fiat, you're likely to feel profoundly deprived and unhappy, even though objectively you have personal transportation.
So it's all relative to what we desire.
Pretty much. This is why winning the lottery, surprisingly, often has the same limited long-term impact on reported happiness levels as suffering a debilitating car accident.
Wait, really? How can that be?
Because our expectations adjust incredibly quickly. Win a lottery. Suddenly you expect a mansion, fancy cars, endless travel. Your desires balloon, often faster than your ability to satisfy them, leaving you potentially just as dissatisfied as before or even more so. Suffer an accident. Your expectations might lower dramatically, allowing you to find contentment in smaller things you previously took for granted. Our internal baseline tends to reassert itself.
Wow. That puts a very different spin on chasing happiness through external success.
It does, and it leads Harari to an even more radical, perhaps biological conclusion. He argues that happiness ultimately might just be about pleasant sensations in our bodies.
Pleasant sensations, like chemicals.
Pretty much. Driven by complex biochemical processes, the flow of specific hormones like serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, and patterns of electrical signals firing in the brain. Our biochemical system, shaped by millions of years of evolution, seems programmed to keep our overall happiness levels relatively constant, fluctuating around a set point.
Why wouldn't evolution select for constant happiness? That sounds better.
From evolution's perspective, eternal, unending bliss wouldn't be very useful for survival and reproduction. Evolution only selects for enough happiness, usually fleeting, to encourage us to pursue things beneficial for gene propagation, food, sex, social bonding. Pleasant feelings, like the rush from eating a good meal or achieving a goal, quickly subside. Why? To motivate us to seek more, ensuring we don't just rest on our laurels and die of starvation or inaction after one satisfying experience. The biochemical carrot keeps us moving.
That's a very deterministic view. Kind of depressing, actually. It challenges free will, doesn't it?
It does feel deterministic, and it profoundly challenges our common-sense notions of free will and sustained joy achieved through external means.
How does this biological view contrast with other perspectives, like liberalism?
They contrast sharply. Liberalism, for example, tends to sanctify individual subjective feelings. Your feelings, what makes you feel good or bad, are seen as the supreme source of authority for determining what is good, beautiful, or politically right. The voter knows best. The customer is always right.
My feelings are my truth.
Kind of, yeah. But the biological perspective suggests those feelings might just be fleeting biochemical fluctuations, not a reliable guide to ultimate truth or lasting well-being. And here, the book offers Buddhism's profound insight as a powerful counterpoint or alternative.
Buddhism's take on happiness.
Yes, Buddhism reached a similar conclusion thousands of years ago. Chasing pleasant feelings is futile because they are inherently impermanent, like ripples on water. The more we crave them, the more we suffer when they inevitably fade or when unpleasant feelings arise. True happiness, or perhaps better termed serenity or liberation, Buddhism suggests, is independent not only of external conditions, but also of our own inner feelings.
Independent of feelings, how?
By understanding their true nature. The key, according to this perspective, is to know the truth about yourself, to observe your feelings arise and pass away without identifying with them, without being enslaved by the craving for pleasant ones and aversion to unpleasant ones. It's about detachment and self-understanding, not chasing biochemical highs.
That's a very different path to contentment.
A radically different path, focused inward rather than outward.
Okay, so after this vast sweep of history, questioning progress and happiness, where does Harari leave us? What about the future?
The final section of the book turns towards the future, and it's perhaps the most speculative and mind-bending part. Harari suggests that Homo sapiens, after 4 billion years of evolution by blind natural selection, now stands on the verge of ending that process and beginning a new era, evolution by intelligent design. Our intelligent design.
Replacing natural selection with us.
Essentially, yes. We are on the cusp, he argues, of becoming like gods, acquiring abilities previously relegated to mythology. Internal youth, perhaps, and divine abilities of creation and destruction through rapid advances in biological engineering, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence.
Biological engineering, what does that encompass?
Harari defines it broadly as deliberate human intervention at the biological level to modify an organism's shape, its capabilities, its needs, or even its fundamental desires, all to realize some preconceived cultural idea of what that organism should be like.
We've been doing that with plants and animals for ages, right? Domestication.
Exactly. Humans have been biological engineers, in a rudimentary sense, for millennia. Castrating bulls to create docile oxen for labor, selectively breeding dogs for specific traits, even castrating young human males to create high-pitched sopranos for choirs or loyal eunuchs for imperial courts.
Right. Changing biology for cultural purposes.
But the future holds the potential for far more sophisticated, precise, and profound interventions. Moving beyond animals and eunuchs to fundamentally redesigning ourselves, our bodies, our minds, our lifespans at the genetic and neural level.
That's a staggering thought, redesigning our own species. Could that lead to a new kind of human?
Harari speculates exactly that. He notes that the original cognitive revolution, which transformed us from insignificant apes to masters of the planet, likely didn't require massive physical changes to our bodies, just relatively small internal changes to brain structure and wiring. He muses that perhaps another, similarly small change, maybe a targeted genetic tweak, a new brain-computer interface, a breakthrough in AI alignment could ignite a second cognitive revolution. This could potentially create a completely new type of consciousness, something perhaps as different from us as we are from Neanderthals, fundamentally transforming Homo sapiens into something altogether different, something beyond what we currently understand as human.
Wow. And this isn't just science fiction, the idea of producing superhumans.
It's moving rapidly from science fiction towards potential reality. What's truly fascinating and perhaps terrifying is the accelerating progress towards deliberately producing superhumans with enhanced cognitive abilities, radically different emotional landscapes, or vastly extended lifespans. While the technical barriers are still significant, they might not be insurmountable for much longer. Ethical and political objections have certainly slowed research in areas like human genetic enhancement.
Understandably so.
Absolutely. But can these objections permanently hold back the allure of prolonging life indefinitely, curing currently incurable diseases like Alzheimer's, or upgrading our cognitive and emotional capacities? The military and economic pressures might become immense. The book provides examples already hinting at this future. People like Jesse Sullivan and Claudia Mitchell, who lost arms and now use sophisticated bionic replacements operated directly by their thoughts. Some interfaces are even starting to provide sensory feedback, allowing them to feel touch through the prosthetic.
That's incredible. Seamless integration of technology and biology.
It demonstrates how close we might be to fundamentally enhancing our natural capabilities in ways previously unimaginable.
But this leads to a really provocative and frankly chilling thought Harari raises at the end. It echoes Frankenstein, but maybe on a societal scale.
What's that?
He warns that while our modern world prides itself, at least ideologically, on recognizing the fundamental equality of all humans, we might be poised through these new technologies to create the most unequal of all societies in history.
How so? More unequal than masters and slaves.
Potentially, yes, in a biological sense. Historically, upper classes only claimed to be inherently superior, based on myths and imagined orders. But with new medical and biological capabilities, genetic enhancements, cognitive upgrades, life extension available only to the wealthy.
Their pretensions of superiority might soon become an objective reality. The gap wouldn't just be wealth or status, it could become biological.
A literal biological caste system.
Exactly. He knows that we prefer the familiar story of Frankenstein creating a grotesque monster that we ultimately had to destroy. It comforts us, reinforcing our sense of mastery and superiority. Nothing we create could ever truly surpass us.
Right, the creation turns bad.
But what if, Harari asks, future scientists, perhaps unburdened by our current ethical frameworks or driven by state competition, create something truly superior, a new type of human or even post-human intelligence, something that looks back at us, ordinary Homo sapiens, as condescendingly, perhaps even as dismissively as we now look back at the Neanderthals. Are we prepared, psychologically or politically, for that kind of existential challenge to our identity as the pinnacle of creation?
That is a profound and deeply unsettling question to end on. Wow, what an absolutely incredible deep dive into Sapiens. We've covered so much ground, journeying from a world with multiple human species through the revolutionary birth of fiction and imagined realities to the profound, often double-edged consequences of the agricultural revolution.
Then exploring those great unifying forces, money, empires, and universal religions that drew humanity together, for better or worse.
And finally, looking ahead to the mind-bending possibilities and perhaps dangers of our future, the potential for a new kind of human designed by us.
Yeah, we've seen throughout this summary how our species' unique ability to create and crucially believe in shared myths, these imagined realities, has been the absolute driving force behind our unprecedented cooperation and ultimately our planetary dominance. But it's clear this immense power comes with a really complex, often uncomfortable legacy. From triggering ecological disasters early on, to creating and perpetuating deep social inequalities, and raising that persistent, nagging question about what truly constitutes human happiness and well-being.
Ultimately, I think this deep dive really shows us that while our collective power as a species has surged exponentially, especially in recent centuries, it hasn't necessarily translated into improved well-being for the average individual sapiens. And it has often caused immense, almost unimaginable misery to countless other animals who share the planet with us.
Yeah.
It deeply challenges us to reconsider what progress truly means, and maybe more importantly, progress for whom.
And as we stand right now, on the verge of acquiring what Harari calls these divine abilities of creation and destruction, through advanced biological engineering, genetic manipulation, AI.
Perhaps the ultimate question this book leaves for you, our listener, isn't just what can we become, what amazing feats are technically possible, but maybe more urgently, who do we choose to be? And for whom do we decide to wield this immense, unprecedented power? What profound responsibility comes with the ability to potentially design life itself?
Heavy questions. Plenty to think about.
Definitely plenty to ponder. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Sapiens. We really hope it sparked your curiosity and gave you a lot to chew on.